This week, I'm going to introduce to you logical reasoning and the rhetorical concept of the enthymeme. These two concepts are going to be key to help you build one of your observation journals into a full essay next week. So this week is important groundwork and background information to help you be ready to do that. In particular, at the end of your observation journal assignment, I state that your interpretation should follow from and be consistent with your observations. What does it mean for an interpretation to follow from observations? That's what we're going to find out this week by looking at logical reasoning, enthymemes, and logical arguments in visual texts. So first, let's think about the two forms of logic. There's two ways you can think, two different approaches to making a logical argument. The first is the deductive method, and the second is the inductive method. And these are completely different forms of reasoning. Deduction starts with a big principle. We call this the major premise or the theory. And then we apply that theory to different particular instances to figure out if something follows or fits within the definition and therefore has to have the application of that general concept applied to it. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Induction is just the opposite. We don't start with any big principles. We start with particular observations and we build toward a hypothesis about a general rule that results from the probability that that pattern will continue to be true in the world. So let's take a look at each of those more specifically. So here's deduction, and here's a deductive argument following a very classic looking deductive form called the syllogism, which we're going to look at in some detail here in this lesson. But here's what it looks like. I just want to look at it very briefly for a moment here and compare it to induction. So in deduction, you'll see it always starts with what we call a major premise, a very big statement or a very general statement about the world. All men are mortal. That's the first premise of this argument. All men are mortal. This is Socrates, this is Plato's famous example of the syllogism. And you can see that in classical Greece, folks didn't care so much about gender-neutral language, so we say all men instead of all men and women. But no matter, we'll go with the classical form here. All men are mortal. Of course, women too. What we mean really here is humans, right? The second statement is Socrates is a man. So this is a minor premise, and it's a specific case. We now are just talking about one individual, and we've put that individual in the class of things that are people or men. So now that we know that all men are mortal, and Socrates belongs to that category of things, men, we can conclude that Socrates is mortal. And that's the conclusion. Those three dots you see on the left here, this is the classical logical, this is the formal logic symbol for therefore, or it follows that, right? It follows that Socrates is mortal. If these two statements are true, then it follows that Socrates is mortal. Now, what's really just happened here is a law of transitivity, or a law of transfer. We know that all of this category has this quality. We know that this person is part of that category, and so we're just connecting, we're just sort of stitching together these two statements to create a logical conclusion that follows from that. Okay, we'll say a couple more things specifically about this in a second, but let's flip over to an inductive argument, just so to show you, to compare and contrast deduction and induction. An inductive argument doesn't start with a big general statement like all men are mortal. It starts with a very particular instance, one event or one observation. Now this is a kind of a humorous example of a chicken. His master has fed him today, and then he recognizes this pattern. This happens again the next day. He gets fed the day after that, and the day after that. And in the process of induction, in the logic of induction, we that chicken rightfully starts to form a hypothesis that he will be fed the next day and indefinitely after that. He will feed me tomorrow. Of course, the joke here is on the chicken because this is the humorous part of the example, because of course the farmer is just fattening up the chicken to eventually kill it and eat it. But the inductive reasoning is very sound. Induction works like this. We take small observations, we look at the pattern, and we realize they all add up to a probabilistic statement about about the pattern. We extrapolate the pattern into a general statement, right? So just to review, we went in deduction from a general statement about reality, all men are mortal, down to a specific case. In induction, we went from very specific cases to a general statement. And that's why this diagram of the two triangles shows that there's a kind of symmetry, a kind of mirroring of logic between the two systems. One goes down and the other goes up. Okay. Now, one of the differences, though, between deduction and induction is the nature of the conclusions we draw. We draw what we call necessary logical conclusions from deduction. When we have a deductive form that's valid, and I'll explain what that means in a second. When we have a valid formal deductive argument, the conclusion must follow. It's necessary. It has to follow. If all men are indeed mortal and Socrates is indeed a man, then it must be true. It's been necessarily true that he is mortal. If you know certain things go in certain categories, you know that the essential qualities of that category must apply to it. And that's why we call deductive logic a kind of logic that creates necessary conclusions. In inductive logic, we have a very different situation. We don't have, if you remember, we don't have the general statement. We don't have the general principle of life. We have to build towards it. Okay, so let's go back to the syllogism. This is the form that we work in to create deductive arguments. And look at what the syllogism has in it. It has a major premise. This is the general statement. It's a universal claim. All men are mortal, or something like that. They're not all as big as that, but they're bigger than the next part. The next part is always a very specific, smaller version, a particular application of the first part. Socrates is a man. We call that the minor premise. So we have the big thing, that's the major premise. The minor premise is the specific application, and the conclusion is just connecting the two terms that are both in the major premise and the minor premise. Look back at the major premise. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. What term or concept appears in both of those statements? It's the concept of man. So that's called the middle term. And in the conclusion, in a syllogism, we just erase the middle term and connect the two remaining terms. Socrates is mortal. And that's a very useful thing to recognize about syllogisms, is if you recognize what the middle term is, in this case it's men, then we know that the conclusion has to have the other parts of the syllogism, not the middle term. Okay, that's a syllogism. Major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. The middle term is the term that shows up in both major and minor premise. The conclusion has the two remaining terms joined together. Okay, let's look at a couple syllogisms. No frogs are mammals. Kermit is a frog. Therefore, Kermit is not a mammal. Okay, now that is a good syllogism. It is taking a big statement, no frogs are mammals. It's finding a specific application. Kermit is a frog. And it's connecting the two terms that are not the middle terms. What's the term that shows up in both of these? Frogs, okay? So Kermit and mammal show up in the conclusion. Now it sounds a little different, and that's only because we have a negative statement. We are saying that no frogs are mammals. In the Socrates example, we said all men are mortal. So it still works the same way, but we're just making a different kind of observation. Nothing in this category is this kind of thing. All right? Now what I'm going to show you, because this is a very brief overview of logic. I'm not trying to get I don't want you to memorize all these things or become an expert, but this is one of the things I really do want you to see. I've shown you all this to show you this. And this is a very fancy $10 word that you'll impress people with if you know what it is. It's called the enthymeme. The enthymeme. And what that simply means is the missing premise or the implied premise. So we remember that syllogisms have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, and has 3 parts. Those are deductive syllogisms. Well, in the real world, we use deductive syllogisms all the time, but we don't put them in that formal structure of 3 parts, major, minor, premises, and conclusion. We don't do that. We don't need to do that because we've gotten so good as language users and as communicators and as rational creatures that we can make a kind of leap, a logical leap, to fill in the missing premise or premises. And so we actually don't talk in formal logical structures, we talk in enthymemes. And so what am I talking about? So I wouldn't go up to somebody and say, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But I might say something like, Socrates is mortal because he's human. Okay, so in that sentence, I've captured 2 of the parts of the syllogism. If I go back, we can review what the original syllogism said. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. So I've caught 2 of in my statement here. Socrates is mortal because he's human. I've kind of said in a slightly less formal way 2 parts of them. Can you think about which 2 I'm using? Yeah, I'm using the second premise and the conclusion in that statement. I'm saying Socrates is a man. He's human. That's that part. And then I've also said Socrates is mortal. That's that part. That's actually the conclusion of the original syllogism. This is the second premise of the original second syllogism. So what's missing? I've implied, I've left out, I let the person I'm talking to fill in the missing part. All humans are mortal. I didn't say that. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Who needs to hear that part? I don't need to spell that out in a informal conversation with somebody. Socrates is a man because he's mortal. Makes perfect sense because we all know that humans are mortal. I didn't even need to bother with explicitly stating that general rule of life, right? Now, enthymemes are interesting because you can leave out any of the 3 parts of the 3-part syllogism. You can leave out any 3 parts. Here we left out the major premise. Let's see what another one does. I'm going to the store because I need some milk. I'm going to the store because I need some milk. Okay. And I've written here the missing premise, the premise that was left out. The store has milk. All right. Or if you want to be formal about it, all stores have milk, right? Those 2 things go together. So notice that I left this out. Of course, the person listening to me knows the store has milk because that's where milk is. That's where you buy it, right? But I didn't spell that out. I just left that to the reader to figure out. One more. I'm going to the store for some milk. Now, here I've gone to another level. Instead of saying 2 of the 3 and leaving out 1, I've only said 1 of the 3 and left out 2. Right? I'm going to the store for some milk. Well, apparently he needed some milk. That's why he's going. And apparently the store has it. Make sense? And if you wanted to spell this out in the formal syllogistic form, it would look like this. The store has milk. I need some milk. So I'm going to the store, right? I didn't need to say those parts. This, in real life, works perfectly fine, but it does imply a couple of assumptions. And those assumptions are, the store has milk and I need some milk. Okay, let's look at another example of this. I'm going out to buy a car. This is imaginary, like, a couple, husband and wife, perhaps. I'm going to buy a car. Whoa, shouldn't we discuss this first? Why? Because buying a car is a big decision. Okay, so this is a very brief conversation between 2 people. And what is this person arguing, the second person? You should discuss things with big decisions with me, right? This was an imply. She didn't say that. He or she didn't say that when she was arguing back. But the implied assumption is that you should always discuss big decisions, right? So if we paused their conversation and wrote this out as a deductive statement, a deductive argument, we would write, big decisions should be discussed. It's a general rule. People should follow that rule. It's common courtesy, right? In this specific case, buying a car is a big decision. Now, he wants to go out and buy a car, so this is a case in which the rule applies, right? We should discuss buying a car. Okay, this seems very basic. This should be pretty easy for you, but I want you to see what's happening in very common everyday language use. We're seeing how people infer, or I should say imply, certain assumed rules or principles of life, certain assumptions, often the major premise, sometimes other parts. But enthymemes are how people actually use language, and you're eventually going to learn how to practice picking out when these assumptions are being made in a text, so you can observe and analyze the logic that they're using. All right, let's do another enthymeme or two. Christy is only human, so she's going to make mistakes. Okay, this is one for you to try. Christy is only human, so she's going to make mistakes. This has a missing premise or conclusion. One of the three parts are missing. Can you figure out which one is missing? There's two of them here. Christy is only human. She's going to make mistakes. Those are two separate parts of the syllogism. What's the last part? It should be, you should have gotten something like, humans make mistakes. All humans make mistakes. Something like that would be the correct answer. So which part of the syllogism is that missing premise? Is it the major premise that states the general rule, the minor premise that states the specific application of the rule, or the conclusion? Yeah, you should have said major premise. All humans make mistakes. That is a major premise. It states the specific rule. That's the major premise, the first part of the syllogism. The bigger the burger, the better the burger. The burgers are better at Burger King. Okay, so this one is a humorous advertising kind of statement. Let's see what the logic is behind this theoretical advertising slogan. The bigger the burger, the better the burger. All right, that's one of the three parts of the syllogism. The burgers are better at Burger King. That's a second part of the syllogism. What's the missing statement? There's a third part in here that's being implied. Think about it. What's the missing part? Yeah, it should be the burgers are bigger at Burger King. Now, they only imply that. They don't actually state that. So that's kind of interesting. Like, we could go out to Burger King and check it out. Is this actually true? They aren't actually promising that, right? And so this gets into what we'll be looking at in a second, is the rhetorical effect of enthymemes, how you can choose which part of the syllogism to leave out in order to get different effects. Okay, so then let's look at this one. This one leaves out two parts. So for this one, you have to imagine somebody just said, I got accepted to Princeton. And the person who's responding says, oh, only snobby people boast about their achievements. Okay, so there's one of the three. In enthymemes, you can actually leave out two of the three parts. So this one, like the example we saw earlier, leaves out two of the three parts. So what's missing here? Only snobby people boast about their achievements. We have a person who just did that. Her name is Jan, let's say. She just got accepted to Princeton. And then Sal says, only snobby people boast about their achievements. What is she saying? What is she implying? What is she assuming? There's two missing parts here. Okay, so something like the conclusion is easiest, right? clearly Sal is saying that Jan is implying that Jan is a snobby person. So we know that the conclusion should probably be Jan is a snobby person. Okay, so that's the second part. What's the last part? Only snobby people boast about their achievements. Jan is a snobby person. So clearly, Jan boasted about her achievements, and she's right because Jan just did. What she's actually doing is interpreting what Jan just said. I got accepted to Princeton as a boast, right? So that's where we could probably argue back with Sal and say, well, don't be so ungracious to Jan. She's not being a snob. She's not really boasting. She's just reporting or something, right? That's an interpretive statement. What Sal is saying is that was a boast, and since only snobby people boast, Jan is a snob. Poor Sal, she must be a little jealous. Okay, but you see what's happened here is she's actually implied a whole syllogism by connecting or by implying, by subtracting two parts of a three-part argument. Okay, so let's look at what I was just talking about, the rhetorical effect of leaving out different parts of a syllogism, right? When we say rhetorical effect, what we mean is the tone of what we're saying, the kind of feeling it creates in the person who's listening or reading, right? The implied the connotations, the implied aspects of it, right? So when you choose, or if you're reading an author who's choosing which part or parts to leave out of a syllogism, you can consider why they might be leaving out the parts they're leaving out. What different effects might that create, right? So here we have our Burger King syllogism here. Bigger is better. Burgers are Burger King are bigger, so the burgers are better at Burger King, right? Time to get your B's today. We're going to say lots of B's. All right, so we could put this syllogism in enthymemic form, in the enthymeme form, taking out one premise, in three different ways, right? If we just take out one premise, it gives us three different combinational options. We could take out the minor premise, right? The bigger the burger, the better the burger, major premise. And the conclusion, the burgers are better at Burger King. We looked at the minor premise. We could take out the conclusion and just have the major and the minor premise. Or we could just take out the major premise and write it like this. The burgers are better at Burger King. That's the conclusion. Because they are bigger. That's the minor premise, right? The burgers are bigger at Burger King. So here, what we haven't said is that the bigger, the better. We haven't actually stated the major premise. Yeah. Now you can ask yourself which of these sounds the most natural. Which one would you use in a conversation with somebody, like informally? You can ask which one sounds best for a advertisement, right? Which one sounds the least manipulative, the most manipulative, and those sorts of things, right? A very popular choice in regular speech is to leave out the major premise. Why? Because people, we know, we just have ingrained in us a lot of the basic things about life. People die, people are mortal. So-and-so, people are imperfect. So-and-so is a human being, so of course they're going to make mistakes. Of course bigger is better. This is a kind of a cultural assumption. I chose this one as an interesting example because a lot of people would automatically assume bigger is better. But as we know, as we're getting better at understanding nutrition and bodily health, more quantity of something is not always a good thing. So this is a questionable assumption. Actually, it's this, the major premise. Bigger is better. That's a questionable assumption, but it is an argument. It is a theory about food, and you can make these kinds of claims using it. Let's look at one more example of how choosing which premise or premises to leave out creates different effects. What if you had this argument, right? Men who sound whiny are unattractive. You are sounding whiny right now, so you are unattractive right now. Again, in real life, you wouldn't spell it all out like that. You'd probably say it one of these ways. Men who are whiny are unattractive. You are whiny right now. Right? What does that make you feel like? That's probably like, oh, she's trying to be nice to me. She's I'm assuming this is a guy and a girl, right? She's trying to just imply that she thinks I'm unattractive. That's kind of a nice way of putting it, even though it hurts, right? You sound whiny right now. It's unattractive, right? Now this one is more direct. It's just naming what she's feeling and why. And I can figure out what she's leaving out is that it's not attractive to be whiny. And that makes sense. So this one is kind of like direct and very logical. It feels very logical to me, at least. Now, what if you said just one? This one just says the major premise. Men who sound whiny are unattractive. It just says it. And that person can make, if you're the boyfriend or the husband, you can make the inference yourself. Oh my gosh, I guess I'm whining right now, and that's unattractive to her. And this one is just the conclusion and leaves out both the major and the minor premise. This one is the most elusive or vague because it doesn't name why he sounds unattractive. He might be able to figure out from context that it's because he's whining, but if he's not recognizing himself as whining, he might miss the hint, right? You are unattractive right now. Maybe it's because he thinks that she's perceiving him as yelling, or maybe because what he's wearing. So she's not naming it. So this one could be misunderstood. But the point here is, in her head, she might be thinking this, but she's only saying this. Okay? So these are just various examples of how deductive logic works in kind of real-world situations in the form of enthymemes. Now, your homework this week is a practice set or a worksheet in which you'll try putting arguments into standard form or the syllogistic form and practice identifying the missing parts of enthymemic arguments. Finally, the homework asks you to analyze a few visual texts and to write out in standard form the logical argument you think the visual text is making. And you're going to have to construct those statements on your own based on how you're interpreting the image. So let's look at one. Okay, so you can look at the image first of all, and you can see for yourself what it's trying to make you feel or do, right? What's the purpose? To get men to join the submarine service, right? So here's a good trick. Always start with the purpose. What is the purpose? That's the first thing to determine. They want men to join the submarine service, so we can put that as the conclusion. Then we have to figure out what is the major claim or premise, logical premise for why we should do that. Well, looking at this advertisement, you see the prominent subject matter or theme is that there's this man and woman embracing. They look very happy. This is a good embrace, not a bad embrace. They look perhaps in love. And then there's subtle clues that she's not just only in love with him, but that she admires him. Namely, she's touching his badge here, which is obviously symbolic for his rank or his participation in the Navy, the Army, the naval forces. So something about him being the status of a submarine serviceman is admirable to her, right? He's in his uniform. Obviously, he's clearly identified, right? She's not identified in anything other than being a beautiful woman, but that's all they need. They just want you to feel that you should be a serviceman because you want to be admired by women. All right, so you see I've written it out in standard form here. Women admire men who are who volunteer for the submarine service. Here's the words that explain exactly what's going on, right? He volunteered. And so if this is true, how do you get from this major premise, the value or the main suggestion of the image, how do you get from that to the conclusion? Well, the minor premise, I had to fill in myself, so I wrote it out like this. You presumably a man, right? This wouldn't work for a woman. They want men to join the service in this advertisement, at least. You want to be admired by women. Now, that's an assumption, right? Nobody is forcing me to agree with that. Maybe I'm already married. Maybe I'm just going to be a celibate man, or maybe I'm not attracted to women. It's assuming this, right? And if that doesn't appeal to me, then this argument is not going to work, right? But it's pretty safe to say that many men will agree with this. And so this argument ends up being a pretty clear and straightforward one that works probably much of the time, right? So this is what you're doing for your homework. You're going to look at several images and fill in the logical argument. Okay, now you should complete the logic practice set linked in this week on Foxtail. For your observation journal this week, you will be allowed to select one of the artworks or advertisements from the last section of this practice set, and you can expand your work on that into a full observation journal entry, the standard 2-page entry. All right, have a great week. I will see you next week.